Earth's systems. So Earth has four main systems. And actually in science, really a system is anything we kind of set a boundary around to study it. But there are four main systems for Earth. We have the geosphere, which is all of the rocky, solid part of the Earth, and the mantle and the magma and all that good stuff, the molten rock below the surface. The atmosphere, which is all of the gases surrounding the planet. The hydrosphere, which is all of the water on the planet, either on the surface or groundwater or in the atmosphere. And then also the biosphere, which is all of the living things on the planet. Now, each of these systems is unique, but they do all interact with each other. That's why you have all the arrows in the diagram here. So the hydrosphere interacts with the geosphere and vice versa, and the same with the biosphere. So they all interact with each other. And again, boundaries for these are defined for study purposes. And again, in science, a system is anything we kind of draw a boundary around just to study. Like in chemistry, it may be a beaker sitting on a table. That's your whole system. Well, for earth science, we kind of define these four major systems, and then you may define smaller systems for study. But these are the four major systems. So geosphere. So the geosphere is the area from the surface of the Earth all the way down to its center or its core. The rigid outer shell of this is called the crust, and it's anywhere between 8 and 40 kilometers thick, kind of depending on where you are. The oceanic crust, which is the crust under the oceans, is a lot younger than the continental crust, which is where the land is. Oceanic crust is about 200 million years old on average. It's also the thinner crust. The continental crust is thicker and about 4 billion years old. Not really on average, but the oldest parts are about 4 billion years old. The mantle is below the crust. So the mantle is down here. It's about 2,900 kilometers thick. And the temperatures there range anywhere from 100 degrees Celsius to about 4,000 degrees Celsius in the mantle. You have a lot of molten rock here. Then you have the core, which is at the center. You have temperatures up to 7,000 degrees Celsius there. But you actually have the outer core, which is about 2,250 kilometers thick, or 2,250 kilometers thick. And then the inner core, which is about 1,300 kilometers. Now, the inner core is solid. The outer core is liquid. The atmosphere. So the atmosphere is the blanket of gases that surrounds the Earth or any other planet or moon, really. The Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, and then the last 1% is really a mixture of water vapor and argon and carbon dioxide gas and other trace gases. If we kind of break down that 1%, you see that really a big chunk of that is argon. And then out of what's left, you have is sort of in order of abundance: carbon dioxide, neon, helium, methane, etc. Okay, so the atmosphere does a few things for us. It provides oxygen for living things, for starters. Also blocks radiation from the sun and maintains a temperature suitable for life. Hydrosphere. So the hydrosphere is all the water on Earth, including water in Earth's atmosphere. So about 97% of that water is salt water in the oceans. So the vast majority of the water is in the oceans as salt water. 3% is fresh water in lakes, rivers, glaciers, and groundwater. So the fresh water is kind of distributed among a bunch of different places. So a small fraction, about 0.4% of the fresh water, is in lakes, ponds, streams, and rivers, which is all the water that we typically think of around here. We think of lakes and we think of ponds and we think of streams and rivers and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, you may think about the ocean if you're going on vacation, but usually if you're here, you're thinking about one of these four things, or puddles. But then the cryosphere is the region of permanently frozen water on Earth. So that would be your glaciers, That would be your ice caps. That would be your sea ice and that sort of thing. Okay. The biosphere. So the biosphere includes all living organisms on Earth as well as the environments in which they live. Most organisms live within a few meters of the Earth's surface. So most of them are either right on the surface or a little bit below or a little bit above. Some organisms do live very deep in the oceans. We found organisms all the way at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is 7 miles down. So we found organisms, as deep in the ocean as we can go. Organisms high atop mountains. So at the tops of mountains, there are organisms living there, and organisms in the atmosphere, particularly bacteria and stuff that are on dust and grains of pollen and stuff like that. So, but most of the organisms do live within a few meters of the surface, but there are organisms scattered everywhere. All forms of life must interact with at least one of the other systems to survive, usually interact with multiple other systems. For example, as humans, we have to breathe oxygen, so we are interacting with the atmosphere. We have to drink water, so we are interacting with the hydrosphere. We indirectly we interact with the geosphere directly if we think about building materials and stuff like that, or indirectly through food that we eat, like growing crops. And then coevolution of the biosphere and other systems. So the biosphere kind of evolved along with these other systems. And this diagram here just kind of shows really this whole hierarchy of really everything in science as far as matter is concerned, or as far as living things are concerned. So we start with the very biggest system. We have the biosphere. So the biosphere is the largest and most complex system. Below that, you have ecosystems. Below that, you have communities. Then below that, you have populations. Then you have organisms. So organisms really kind of, we think about that as like the individual organism. So like one cat, one dog, whatever. A population would be all of a specific organism, like say white-tailed deer, living in a certain area at a certain time. That would be a population. Community would be all of the interacting organisms in an area. So the deer, the rabbits, the trees, the grass, etc. That would be a community. The ecosystem would include those communities plus the abiotic factors, so the water, the soil. Well, soil's biotic, but the water and the rocks and the air and the sunlight and all that stuff. And then the biosphere. Now, if we go below organisms, you start to get into organ systems, individual organs like heart and lungs, etc. Tissues that make up the different organs, and then cells. And then below cells, really, we're kind of talking about things that aren't really alive by themselves anymore. So you got organelles, which are small organs, basically in the cells, like mitochondria and ribosomes, etc. Macromolecules, which are just large molecules. Molecules, which are smaller molecules. Atoms, and you get down to subatomic particles. So this is a whole hierarchy, though, all the way from subatomic particles all the way up to the biosphere. So examples of interdependence. So this is just an example, really, of some interdependence here. So Earth's present atmosphere formed through interactions with the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. Oxygen really was released via photosynthesis about 2.5 billion years ago. And really, before that, you had an atmosphere that was made mostly of volcanic gases, which would be carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Not really any oxygen in the atmosphere at that time, water vapor, that sort of thing. Well, the rain, as rain falls, it tends to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So some of the CO2 is washed out of the atmosphere. And then eventually you had the rise of photosynthesis, and then that started converting some of that CO2 into oxygen. But then basically once that oxygen was produced, that greatly influenced the evolution of complex life, because complex life kind of relies on oxygen. Without oxygen, you can have very simple life. Then you have feedback loops, which increase or decrease changes. So as you get more more oxygen in the atmosphere, you would end up with a feedback loop that would create more complex life, and you'd have more organisms, etc. And then volcanic eruptions also continue to change the atmosphere today. Sometimes you have volcanic eruptions that will cause periods where you have decreased temperatures because you have enough ash and stuff to block the sun, for example. But volcanic eruptions do still continue to change the atmosphere.